Black Sands Before Dawn. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. Pacific Ocean. Before sunrise, the island was almost silent. Only the wind moved across the black volcanic sand, carrying the smell of sulfur through miles of tunnels carved beneath Mount Suribachi. Hidden underground, thousands of Japanese soldiers waited in complete darkness. They had been ordered to remain silent, no cheering, no gunfire, no movement that might reveal their positions. Far offshore, the horizon was beginning to disappear behind an armada unlike anything the Pacific had ever witnessed. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of landing craft stretched across the sea. More than 70,000 U.S. Marines were preparing to storm an island only 8 square miles in size. Inside the command bunker, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood something many of his countrymen did not. The Marines approaching his shores were no longer the inexperienced force Japan had encountered during the early years of the war. After Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, they had become veterans of one of history's most brutal campaigns. Kuribayashi had studied them carefully. Reports from earlier battles filled his headquarters. Capture documents, intelligence summaries, and battlefield observations all pointed toward the same conclusion: these soldiers fought differently. They adapted quickly, coordinated overwhelming firepower, and continued advancing despite casualties that would have broken many armies. Yet history often tells this story in simple terms. Popular books, internet articles, and dramatic documentaries frequently claim that Japanese generals feared the U.S. Marines or openly admitted they were unbeatable. But did they really? What did Japanese commanders actually write in their wartime diaries? What appeared in operational reports sent back to Tokyo? How did senior officers describe the Marines after years of fighting across the Pacific? The answers are more complex and far more fascinating than the legends. Because behind every battle was an enemy trying to understand exactly what made the Marine Corps so difficult to stop. Those observations, preserved in military records and post-war testimony, reveal a story not of myth, but of professional soldiers studying one another in one of the fiercest campaigns ever fought. Tonight, we examine the truth about what Japanese generals really thought about the U.S. Marines and what their own words reveal about the Pacific War. An enemy unlike any before. The Pacific War did not begin with the U.S. Marines charging across volcanic beaches. It began years earlier, with an empire convinced that speed, discipline, and relentless offense could reshape Asia. In the 1930s, Imperial Japan expanded rapidly across China and the Western Pacific. Its military leadership believed victory came not through overwhelming industrial power, but through superior fighting spirit. Officers taught that determination, sacrifice, and aggressive action could overcome even a stronger enemy. This philosophy became deeply embedded within both the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the strategy seemed to work. Within months, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, and countless smaller outposts. Allied forces, shocked by the speed of the offensive, struggled to mount an effective defense. Many Japanese commanders concluded that American troops lacked the willingness to endure prolonged hardship. Early victories reinforced the belief that Japan's soldiers possessed a moral advantage impossible to measure with numbers alone. But beneath the surface, another reality was taking shape. The United States possessed something Japan could never match: industrial capacity. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could replace those it lost. Factories produced thousands of aircraft, tanks, artillery pieces, and landing craft every month. More importantly, the United States could train fresh units while keeping experienced formations in combat. The Marine Corps became one of the central instruments of this growing power. Unlike conventional armies fighting across continents, Marines were organized for amphibious warfare, the dangerous task of landing directly onto defended beaches. Every operation demanded extraordinary coordination between naval gunfire, carrier aircraft, engineers, logistics specialists, and infantry. A single mistake in timing could turn an invasion into catastrophe. The first major test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. When the 1st Marine Division landed on the island, the campaign was anything but easy. Supply shortages, tropical diseases, relentless air attacks, and repeated Japanese offensives pushed both sides to their limits. Night after night, Japanese troops launched aggressive assaults against Marine positions, expecting shock attacks in close combat to break American defenses. Instead, they encountered a force that adapted quickly. Marines improved their defensive positions, coordinated artillery with remarkable precision, and relied heavily on supporting fire from aircraft and warships whenever possible. They were not invincible. They suffered heavily. But they absorbed hard lessons and applied them with increasing efficiency. Japanese field reports from Guadalcanal began to reflect a noticeable shift. Rather than dismissing American forces as inexperienced, commanders increasingly described an opponent that learned from every engagement. Intelligence officers paid close attention to Marine communications, logistics, and battlefield organization. They recognized that American strength did not rest on courage alone, but on the ability to combine infantry, artillery, aviation, engineers, and naval support into a single, coordinated system. That realization became even clearer in the years that followed. Operations at Tarawa, Cape Gloucester, Saipan, Tinian, and Peleliu revealed a Marine Corps steadily refining its methods. Every landing incorporated lessons from the last. Specialized flamethrower teams worked alongside tanks. Combat engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Naval bombardments grew more accurate. Closed air support became faster and more responsive. Medical evacuation systems improved survival rates, allowing wounded Marines to receive treatment with unprecedented speed. Japanese commanders watched these developments with increasing concern. They understood that they were no longer facing isolated infantry assaults. They were confronting an entire military system designed to sustain relentless pressure until an objective was secured. Still, they believed that one advantage remained firmly in Japanese hands. The islands themselves. Volcanic ridges, limestone caves, coral cliffs, dense jungle, and elaborate underground fortifications offer defenders opportunities unlike those found on conventional battlefields. Instead of meeting Marines on the beaches, Japanese engineers transformed islands into interconnected fortresses capable of surviving even the heaviest bombardment. If the Americans wanted victory, they would have to earn every yard. And nowhere would that brutal reality become clearer than on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, where years of observation, adaptation, and mutual respect between determined enemies would reach their ultimate test. Through Japanese eyes. By 1944, Japanese commanders had stopped making the mistake of underestimating the Marines. The early victories of the Pacific War had created an image of an enemy that was slow to react and unwilling to endure heavy losses. 2 years later, that image no longer matched reality. Reports arriving from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu described a fighting force that had evolved with every campaign. The men writing these reports were not journalists or propagandists. They were officers responsible for explaining why islands were being lost despite determined resistance. Their observations were often blunt, professional, and surprisingly respectful, not because they admired the enemy, but because understanding him was essential for survival. Angle 1. Discipline under fire. One characteristic appeared repeatedly in Japanese battlefield assessments: discipline. Japanese doctrine placed enormous value on individual courage and offensive spirit. Soldiers were expected to attack aggressively, often at extraordinary personal cost. The Marine Corps approached combat differently. Marine units emphasized coordination before heroics. During assaults, riflemen rarely advanced alone. Machine guns covered exposed ground while mortars suppressed enemy positions. Engineers moved forward to destroy bunkers. Tanks supported infantry whenever terrain allowed. Artillery observers continuously adjusted fire as the battle unfolded. To Japanese officers watching from concealed positions, this level of coordination was striking. Rather than relying on dramatic charges, Marines advanced methodically. If a bunker survived naval bombardment, they called for artillery. If artillery failed, tanks moved closer. If tanks became trapped, engineers approached with demolition charges or flamethrowers. Every obstacle was met with another solution. Captured operational documents and post-war interrogations indicate that Japanese officers recognized this flexibility. They observed that Marine units rarely repeated the same mistake twice. Once an American assault encountered unexpected resistance, commanders altered their approach instead of stubbornly pressing forward. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, preparing the defense of Iwo Jima, understood this pattern. He warned his officers that the Americans would adapt quickly to changing conditions. Any defensive position discovered would eventually become the target of concentrated firepower from multiple directions. For Kuribayashi, the greatest danger was not individual Marines. It was their ability to fight as a coordinated system. Angle 2, the will to keep advancing. Japanese commanders also paid close attention to something less tangible. Endurance. Many believed that heavy casualties would eventually force American attacks to stop. Early assumptions suggested that democratic societies lacked the resolve for prolonged, bloody campaigns far from home. Battle after battle challenged that belief. At Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division encountered one of the most heavily defended atolls in the Pacific. Coral reefs stranded many landing craft before they reached shore. Marines were forced to cross hundreds of yards of open water under relentless machine gun and artillery fire. The first waves suffered devastating losses. Yet the attacks continued. Throughout the day, additional landing waves reached the beaches despite the danger. Small groups reorganized behind seawalls, destroyed fortified positions one by one, and gradually expanded the beachhead. Japanese survivors later described the persistence of the assault as one of its defining features. Even after losing officers, landing craft, and armored support, Marine units continued reorganizing instead of collapsing into confusion. The same pattern emerged during later campaigns. At Peleliu, Marines fought for weeks across jagged coral ridges where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water shortages, sniper fire, hidden cave systems, and constant artillery created conditions that exhausted even experienced veterans. Japanese defenders expected repeated attacks to lose momentum. Instead, fresh units rotated into the fight while logistics ships continued delivering ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and reinforcements. To Japanese commanders, this revealed an advantage extending far beyond courage. The United States possessed an industrial and logistical system capable of sustaining operations that would have been impossible for Japan to match by the later stages of the war. The Marines fighting on the front lines represented only the visible edge of a much larger machine stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean. Understanding that machine became one of the greatest challenges facing Japan's military leadership. Because defeating the Marines meant confronting not only determined infantry, but also the factories, shipyards, supply convoys, aircraft carriers, and naval power supporting every step they took. And nowhere would that realization become more apparent than during the brutal island campaigns of 1944 and 1945, where Japanese commanders witnessed the full integration of American firepower, leadership, and battlefield adaptability. Firepower, leadership, and an enemy that kept learning. By late 1944, Japanese commanders no longer judged the U.S. Marines solely by the courage of individual soldiers. They had come to understand that the Marines' greatest strength lay in how every element of the battlefield worked together. Infantry, tanks, artillery, naval guns, engineers, and aircraft operated as parts of a single system. Defeating one element rarely stopped the advance because another immediately filled the gap. This was a form of warfare that Japan had not expected to face on such a scale. Angle 3. The weight of American firepower. For Japanese defenders, one of the most shocking aspects of marine operations was the sheer volume of coordinated firepower. Before an amphibious landing, battleships and cruisers often bombarded an island for days. Carrier aircraft struck airfields, artillery positions, supply dumps, and communication centers. Then came naval rockets, followed by landing craft carrying tanks, engineers, flamethrowers, and infantry. Japanese soldiers often survived these bombardments by sheltering inside caves and reinforced tunnels. Many commanders concluded that bombardment alone could not defeat a determined defense. In that assessment, they were correct. But the bombardment was never intended to win the battle by itself. Its purpose was to isolate defenders, destroy communications, and weaken strongpoints before Marines reached the beaches. Once the landing began, artillery observers moved with frontline units, calling in accurate fire within minutes. Aircraft orbited overhead, ready to strike newly discovered bunkers. Engineers blasted tunnel entrances with explosives, while flamethrower tanks forced defenders from positions that conventional weapons could not reach. Japanese reports repeatedly noted this relentless coordination. Whenever one defensive position held, another type of weapon appeared. The battlefield offered almost no time to recover. It was not simply overwhelming firepower that impressed Japanese officers, it was the speed with which different weapons were combined into a single, continuous assault. Angle 4. Leadership under extreme pressure. Japanese commanders also studied the leadership style of Marine officers. In the Imperial Japanese Army, leadership was often closely tied to hierarchy and rigid adherence to orders. Junior officers displayed remarkable bravery, but changing plans in the middle of battle was not always encouraged. Marine leadership evolved differently. Small unit leaders were expected to make immediate decisions when communications failed. Platoon commanders, company officers, and experienced non-commissioned officers frequently adjusted tactics based on changing conditions. Japanese observers noticed that American attacks rarely stopped because one officer had been killed. Another leader stepped forward. If one route became impossible, another was chosen. If a bunker resisted repeated assaults, Marines reorganized instead of launching the same attack again. This flexibility became especially dangerous during prolonged battles. Each failed assault taught the Marines something. Each success gave them another lesson to apply on the next island. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood this better than most. Unlike earlier commanders who had concentrated forces near the beaches, he ordered the construction of an elaborate underground defense stretching for miles beneath Iwo Jima. His reasoning was straightforward. Meeting the Marines directly on the shoreline would only allow American naval gunfire to destroy his forces before the main battle even began. Instead, he planned to force the Marines into a slow, exhausting campaign where every cave, ridge, and tunnel became another battlefield. It was one of the most sophisticated defensive systems Japan built during the entire war. Even so, Kuribayashi never expected victory in the conventional sense. His objective was to inflict such severe casualties that the United States might reconsider future invasions of the Japanese home islands. It was an acknowledgement not of Marine invincibility, but of their growing effectiveness. Respect did not mean surrender. Modern documentaries often claim that Japanese generals feared the Marines or believed they could not be defeated. The historical record paints a more nuanced picture. Professional respect is not the same as despair. Japanese commanders continued fighting with extraordinary determination until the very end of the Pacific War. Even when they recognized the Marines' tactical strengths, they did not abandon their own mission. Instead, they searched for ways to counter those strengths. They redesigned defenses. They expanded tunnel networks. They reduced costly banzai charges. They relied on camouflage, concealed artillery, and attritional warfare rather than immediate counterattacks. These changes reflected careful observation of Marine tactics. The Marines had forced their enemy to adapt. And in war, that is one of the clearest signs that an opponent has become impossible to ignore. Yet no battlefield would test both armies more severely than a small volcanic island lying roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo. There, beneath black ash and shattered rock, General Kuribayashi would put every lesson he had learned into practice. Facing him would be thousands of Marines who had spent 3 years adapting to every challenge the Pacific could offer. Neither side fully understood how costly the coming battle would become. But when the first landing craft touched the beaches of Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945, history entered one of its most brutal chapters. The Battle of Iwo Jima begins. February 19, 1945. 8:59 a.m. The first wave of American landing craft pushed toward the black volcanic shoreline of Iwo Jima. For days beforehand, the island had endured one of the most intense naval bombardments of the Pacific War. Battleships fired thousands of heavy shells. Cruisers and destroyers pounded suspected gun positions. Carrier aircraft swept repeatedly across the island, dropping bombs and rockets on caves, bunkers, and artillery emplacements. From the decks of the American fleet, many believed little could have survived. But deep beneath the volcanic rock, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's men waited in silence. Unlike previous Japanese commanders, Kuribayashi had forbidden the dramatic beach defenses and immediate banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles. He believed those tactics wasted lives against an enemy with overwhelming naval firepower. Instead, he transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress unlike any the Marines had faced. More than 11 miles, 18 kilometers, of interconnected tunnels linked command posts, artillery positions, ammunition depots, hospitals, and hidden firing points. Reinforced concrete bunkers disappeared into the rocky landscape. Heavy guns were concealed behind steel doors that opened only long enough to fire before closing again. Entire companies could move underground without exposing themselves to American aircraft. Kuribayashi's objective was not to stop the landing at the water's edge. It was to draw the Marines inland, where every yard would become a killing ground. As the first Marine stepped onto the beach, something seemed strangely wrong. There was almost no resistance. Only scattered mortar rounds and occasional sniper fire interrupted the landing. Amphibious tractors climbed onto the soft volcanic ash with surprising ease. More waves followed, unloading tanks, artillery pieces, engineers, ammunition, and supplies. Some officers wondered if the bombardment had succeeded beyond expectations. Then, nearly an hour after the first landings, Kuribayashi gave the order. The island erupted. Machine guns hidden inside reinforced bunkers opened fire simultaneously. Mortars crashed into crowded beaches. Heavy artillery shells exploded among parked landing craft and supply dumps. Carefully concealed anti-tank guns targeted armored vehicles struggling through the deep volcanic sand. Within minutes, the landing zone became chaos. The black ash that looked firm from a distance proved almost impossible to cross. Every step sank ankle deep. Vehicles bogged down. Bulldozers worked desperately to carve exits from the beaches while engineers cleared paths under constant fire. Japanese defenders rarely exposed themselves. A bunker that appeared destroyed would suddenly reopen and fire again. Marines advancing toward one cave found themselves under attack from another hidden hundreds of yards away. Every strong point supported the next, creating overlapping fields of fire that made direct assaults extraordinarily costly. Japanese commanders observing from underground positions saw their strategy unfolding exactly as planned. The Marines had landed in overwhelming numbers, but numbers alone offered little protection against carefully prepared defenses. American units became pinned behind low rises in the volcanic sand while officers struggled to reorganize scattered formations. Yet something else became equally clear. The Marines did not panic. Small unit leaders immediately began adapting. Radio operators established communication with offshore artillery. Naval gunfire observers identified surviving Japanese positions. Engineers brought forward explosives while flamethrower teams prepared to attack fortified caves. Rather than launching reckless frontal assaults, Marine commanders began reducing each position systematically. If a bunker resisted rifle fire, tanks engaged it directly. If tanks could not reach, demolition teams moved in under covering fire. Aircraft circled overhead, waiting for coordinates from forward observers. Every surviving Japanese position eventually attracted concentrated attention from multiple weapons at once. This methodical approach impressed even Japanese defenders. Kuribayashi had expected determination. What he encountered was persistence supported by extraordinary logistical coordination. Throughout the first day, landing craft continued arriving despite relentless shelling. Ammunition flowed ashore. Casualties were evacuated back to hospital ships. Replacement units reinforced weakened sectors almost continuously. Japanese officers understood that destroying a single wave of Marines would not stop the invasion. Another wave always followed. By nightfall on February 19th, nearly 30,000 Marines had landed despite suffering heavy casualties. The beaches remained under intermittent artillery fire, but the invasion had established a foothold that could no longer be eliminated. For Kuribayashi, the first phase of the battle had succeeded. His defenses had inflicted severe losses while preserving most of his own forces underground. For the Marines, the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Because beyond the beaches rose the dark silhouette of Mount Suribachi, while to the north stretched a maze of ridges, ravines, and hidden fortifications that would consume thousands more lives before the battle finally ended. In the days ahead, Japanese commanders would witness the full determination of the Marine Corps not in a single dramatic charge, but in the relentless, grinding advance that slowly overcame one of the strongest defensive positions ever constructed in the Pacific. The Final Judgment. By the morning of February 23, 1945, for days after the landings, the southern tip of Iwo Jima had become the focus of the battle. Rising nearly 550 feet above the island, Mount Suribachi dominated the beaches where thousands of Marines continued to unload men and equipment. As long as Japanese observers occupied its slopes, every movement below could be directed into the sights of hidden artillery and mortars. The task of taking the mountain fell to the 28th Marines of the 5th Marine Division. It would not be easy. Every path leading upward was covered by concealed firing ports. Natural caves had been reinforced with concrete and steel. Tunnels allowed Japanese defenders to appear unexpectedly behind advancing Marines before disappearing underground again. Even when a cave entrance was sealed, another opening often existed farther up the mountain. The Marines advanced slowly. Flamethrower operators worked alongside engineers carrying satchel charges. Riflemen protected them from hidden snipers while tanks fired point-blank into fortified positions whenever the steep terrain allowed. Every few yards, another bunker. Every ridge, another machine gun. The fighting was measured not in miles, but in feet. By late morning, a patrol reached the summit. There, a small American flag was raised over Mount Suribachi. Marines across the island erupted in cheers. Ships anchored offshore sounded their horns. For a brief moment, it appeared that the battle's hardest days were over. They were not. The famous photograph of the second flag raising became one of the defining images of the Second World War, but it also created a lasting misconception. To those watching from afar, it suggested victory had already been secured. In reality, nearly three-quarters of the battle still remained. North of Suribachi lay the island's strongest defenses. Kuribayashi had concentrated the majority of his forces around rugged high ground known to the Marines as Hill 382, the Amphitheater, and the Turkey Knob. These names would soon become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. Unlike earlier campaigns, there were no large-scale Japanese counterattacks. Kuribayashi had forbidden them. Instead, every cave, trench, and bunker functioned as part of an interconnected defensive network. Marines could clear one position only to receive fire from another they had never seen. A bunker declared destroyed in the morning might open fire again that afternoon through a concealed secondary entrance. This forced the Marines to change their methods once more. Rather than rushing forward after capturing ground, units paused to search every cave, every tunnel entrance, and every crater. Engineers sealed passages with explosives. Flamethrowers were used where direct assault would have cost even more lives. Tanks equipped with flame projectors became some of the most valuable weapons on the island, capable of reaching defenders buried deep within volcanic rock. Japanese officers observed these tactics closely. What stood out was not simply American firepower, but the Marines' willingness to adapt continuously. If one approach failed, another replaced it. If intelligence revealed a hidden tunnel, artillery and engineers were redirected. If terrain prevented armored support, infantry adjusted their advance instead of abandoning the objective. For Japanese commanders, this adaptability became one of the defining characteristics of the Marine Corps. The Marines were persistent, but they were not inflexible. That distinction mattered. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese doctrine often emphasized holding positions until destruction. Marine doctrine emphasized achieving the mission while constantly modifying tactics to reduce unnecessary losses. The result was a battlefield where American units learned faster with each passing day, while Japanese defenders had fewer opportunities to recover from setbacks. Yet the cost remained staggering. By the time organized resistance finally ended on March 26, 1945, nearly every Japanese defender on Iwo Jima had been killed. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese troops on the island, only a few hundred were captured alive, many because they had been unconscious or severely wounded. The vast majority fought until death, following the expectations of their command and the culture of the imperial military. The Marines also paid an extraordinary price. More than 26,000 American casualties were recorded during the campaign, including nearly 7,000 killed. It remains one of the few battles in U.S. Marine Corps history where American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese defenders. For the commanders who survived long enough to leave records, Iwo Jima confirmed several conclusions already forming after Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Peleliu. American Marines possessed overwhelming logistical support. Their combined arms coordination was unmatched in the Pacific. Their junior leadership adapted rapidly under pressure. And perhaps most importantly, they did not abandon difficult objectives simply because casualties mounted. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi did not live to write a detailed post-war assessment. Believed to have died during the final days of the battle while leading or accompanying a last attack, he left behind letters and orders that reflected realism rather than illusion. He never portrayed the Marines as superhuman, nor did he dismiss them. Instead, he consistently treated them as a capable, determined enemy whose strengths had to be understood with absolute seriousness. That attitude, professional respect without surrender, was shared by many experienced Japanese officers. It is also why historians today caution against the popular claim that Japanese generals simply feared the Marines. The historical evidence tells a more compelling story. They studied them. They adapted because of them. And even as Japan's strategic position collapsed, its commanders continued searching for ways to slow an opponent they had come to recognize as one of the most effective amphibious fighting forces in modern military history. But when the guns finally fell silent, another battle began, the battle over memory. Wartime propaganda, personal memoirs, and popular culture would shape how both sides remembered the Pacific War, sometimes blurring the line between documented history and enduring legend. What the records actually reveal. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, the fighting ended, but the work of understanding the war had only begun. Across the Pacific, Allied intelligence teams entered abandoned headquarters, underground bunkers, and military archives. They collected thousands of documents, operational orders, battlefield reports, intelligence summaries, personal diaries, maps, and official correspondence. Many of these records had survived because they were hidden in caves or buried before Japanese positions were overrun. For military historians, these documents became invaluable. Unlike wartime propaganda designed for public audiences, these reports were written for commanders who needed accurate information. Officers had little reason to exaggerate the strengths or weaknesses of the enemy. Their responsibility was to explain why battles had been won or why they had been lost. As researchers translated and analyzed these records in the years after the war, a consistent picture began to emerge. Japanese commanders rarely described the U.S. Marines with emotional language. Instead, they focused on practical military observations. They noted the Marines' ability to coordinate naval gunfire with infantry movements. They commented on the speed at which engineers removed obstacles and repaired damaged landing zones. They observed how artillery, tanks, aircraft, and rifle companies supported one another throughout an assault. Again and again, the emphasis was not on individual acts of heroism but on organization. American strength, in Japanese eyes, was systemic. Even when a Marine unit suffered heavy casualties, another unit quickly replaced it. Ammunition continued arriving. Medical teams evacuated the wounded with remarkable efficiency. Damaged equipment was repaired or replaced. Naval forces offshore maintained a constant flow of supplies that Japanese commanders increasingly struggled to disrupt as the war progressed. This logistical superiority became one of the most common themes in Japanese military assessments. Several post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers reflected the same conclusion. They acknowledged that the United States possessed an industrial capacity unlike anything Japan could match. Every island campaign reinforced the reality that American losses, though painful, could often be replaced more rapidly than Japan's. Yet these officers also rejected simplistic explanations. They did not claim that the Marines won solely because they had more ships, more aircraft, or more artillery. They recognized the importance of training. Marine units demonstrated disciplined small unit leadership, effective communication under fire, and a willingness to revise tactics based on battlefield experience. Lessons learned at Guadalcanal appeared at Tarawa. Lessons from Tarawa shaped operations at Saipan and Peleliu. By the time of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese commanders faced an opponent that had spent nearly 3 years refining amphibious warfare under combat conditions. This evolution mattered. It explained why defensive methods that succeeded against early American landings became steadily less effective as the war continued. At the same time, historians caution against one of the most persistent myths surrounding the Pacific War, that Japanese generals universally regarded the Marines as unstoppable. The surviving evidence does not support that claim. Japanese commanders continued planning defenses until the final months of the conflict. They believed American advances could be slowed, casualties increased, and strategic decisions influenced through determined resistance. Even General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, fully aware that Iwo Jima would almost certainly fall, designed his defenses to inflict maximum losses rather than expecting an outright victory. His calculations were military, not emotional. He respected his opponent's capabilities without abandoning his own mission. That distinction is important because it reveals how professional soldiers often view one another in war. Respect does not erase hostility. Recognition of an enemy's strengths does not mean surrender. Instead, it reflects the constant effort to understand an opponent well enough to fight effectively. In many ways, that is the clearest answer to our central question. Japanese generals did not leave behind records proclaiming the Marines invincible. What they left behind was something far more valuable: detailed observations of an adversary who forced them to rethink tactics, redesign defenses, and confront the growing reality that the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted beyond Japan's ability to reverse. Those records remain one of the strongest historical foundations for understanding not only the Marine Corps, but also the professionalism and the limits of Japan's wartime leadership. And as historians continue comparing wartime reports with personal memoirs and modern research, an even clearer picture emerges, one that separates enduring legend from documented fact. Beyond the legend. In the decades after the Second World War, the battles of the Pacific became the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, and personal memoirs. Some accounts remain closely tied to official records. Others gradually evolved into legends, repeating dramatic claims that were difficult or impossible to verify. Among the most common was the idea that Japanese generals openly declared the U.S. Marines unbeatable. The historical record tells a different story. Researchers studying Japanese wartime documents have found remarkably few sweeping statements of admiration or fear. Instead, the surviving reports are practical, analytical, and professional. Commanders wrote about artillery effectiveness, logistics, communications, engineering, and battlefield coordination. They evaluated strengths because understanding an enemy was essential to planning the next defense. In many ways, those reports offer an even greater compliment than dramatic quotations ever could. They show that the Marines had become an opponent worthy of serious study. By 1945, Japanese commanders had fundamentally changed how they defended islands. The costly banzai charges that marked the early years of the war largely disappeared. New defensive systems emphasized deep tunnel networks, hidden artillery, camouflage, and prolonged resistance. These changes were not signs of surrender. They were evidence that Japan's military had learned from years of fighting an enemy that constantly adapted. The Marines had changed the battlefield. At the same time, the Marines themselves had been transformed by the Pacific War. The young men who landed on Guadalcanal in 1942 were not the same force that fought across Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. They had paid for every lesson with blood. Every campaign reshaped their tactics, improved their coordination, and strengthened their understanding of amphibious warfare. Victory did not come easily. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa each demanded extraordinary sacrifice. Thousands of Marines never returned home. Thousands of Japanese soldiers also died defending islands they knew were unlikely to be reinforced or relieved. For both sides, these battles became a measure of endurance as much as military skill. Historians today often describe the Pacific War as a contest of adaptation. Japan entered the conflict with highly trained, experienced forces and a doctrine built around offensive spirit. The United States responded with overwhelming industrial capacity, logistical excellence, and an ability to absorb hard lessons from combat. As the war progressed, those strengths became increasingly decisive. Japanese commanders recognized this reality not through myth or dramatic speeches, but through careful observation recorded in reports intended for their own superiors. Those observations remain among the most reliable evidence we possess. They remind us that history is rarely as simple as popular memory suggests. Professional soldiers can respect an enemy without admiring him. They can acknowledge tactical excellence while remaining committed to their own cause. And they can leave behind records that speak more honestly than the legends that follow. Reflection. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, in the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, and among the coral ridges of Peleliu, two determined military traditions collided in one of history's most unforgiving theaters of war. Neither side underestimated the cost. The Japanese commanders who survived did not describe the U.S. Marines as invincible heroes, nor did they dismiss them as ordinary opponents. Instead, they recorded something more meaningful. They faced a force that learned from every battle, combined overwhelming resources with disciplined leadership, and refused to abandon its mission despite enormous losses. That is perhaps the truest answer to the question we began with. The real story is not about fear. It is about recognition. Recognition that victory in the Pacific was shaped not by myths or slogans, but by preparation, adaptation, logistics, leadership, and the extraordinary endurance of the men who fought on both sides. Today, the beaches where those battles raged have long since fallen silent. The gunfire has faded. The bunkers have become historical landmarks. But the documents left behind, the reports, diaries, orders, and letters, still speak. They remind us that the clearest measure of any fighting force is often found not in what it says about itself, but in what its enemy, writing in private and under the weight of war, believed to be true. The truth about what Japanese generals said about the U.S. Marines is ultimately not a story of fear, but of hard-earned respect between determined adversaries whose struggle forever changed the history of the Pacific.